This is Alexander Kriss, a clinical psychologist and author based in New York. He's also a big fan of Silent Hill 2, having written about the game and his personal relationship to it in his book, The Gaming Mind.
I have to say, I'm so excited about this idea. I mean, when I was a kid, I was all about it. I dressed up as James for Halloween one year. I was a big fan.
Today, Alex joins us to break down how Silent Hill 2's nightmarish locations and horrific monsters are drawn from the complex minds of its characters, and see how the remake adapts the most beloved psychological horror game of all time.
One really interesting thing about the game and about James as a protagonist is the way that even when you're indoors, everything is foggy and hard to see. And so it is perhaps a way that he deflects guilt and responsibility. The things he swings at and shoots at, it's only after the fact that he really sees what they are. And that perhaps is not an inherent feature of Silent Hill, but that is part of James's Silent Hill.
We've got another episode with Alex about Silent Hill 2's endings coming very soon, but this video still contains spoilers for the entire game, so consider yourself warned. Right, without further ado, it's over to Alex.
I think that video games have often been dismissed and overlooked in terms of what they can teach us about the individual who's playing them. In my writing and in my work with individuals who play video games, I'm just really interested in seeing video games as another extension of an individual's life and psychology. I'm particularly interested in not just what people play, but how they play them, which is something that's particularly interesting and unique in Silent Hill 2, which we'll talk more about. Silent Hill 2 presents this sort of portrait of grief and loss and guilt through this very dreamlike setting that kind of has this Lynchian quality where it kind of seems like it's not entirely clear that everyone is actually awake or in reality as we understand it. So everything has this kind of heightened quality. In any horror movie or game, right, there's always a moment where the main character is like, what the f***, and is like so shocked by something going on. And that never happens in Silent Hill 2, which I think is so important to the psychological experience of playing it and sort of seeing the narrative through. Everyone is in there with these bizarre, horrific, incongruous experiences, but maintaining this preternatural calm. That what they're going through is not actually scary in like the visceral, fearful sense, but something dreadful. This plodding towards an inevitable ending that is tragic, but seems unavoidable. But there's this glimmer of maybe there can be a resolution, right? I think that's really what the game is about, is this tiny glimmer of hope that maybe there's a way to work through something terrible, even though it seems that all that ever happens is the same thing over and over again. And each character is reliving that loop in their own way. And each ending offers maybe a different, never entirely clear picture on whether it's possible to escape the patterns that we get locked into when we go through trauma and tragedy.
Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago.
What a fantastic opening, right? To open in this filthy bathroom, essentially seems to be looking in the mirror being like, am I really going to do this? Is this real? And I think one really interesting thing about the game and about James as a protagonist is the way that he oscillates between moments where he seems open to the idea that he is suffering psychologically, he's going crazy. And then other times when he's incredibly defensive about that idea, especially around ideas about him potentially being suicidal, and really pushes back and tries to distance himself from other characters, saying like, I'm not like you. Already from the start, we see this like tension that exists not in the world, but actually in James. This is a cool way to start a game.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you.
I think in some ways, Angela is the most fully realized of the people that James meets, that the player meets over the course of the playthrough. Every character that James meets is dealing with their own demons and struggling with their own past. And they also then bring different things out of James. Angela really brings out tension between James's desire to save and even take on a kind of savior-like complex, and this desire to really defend against his own despair and deny that he is in any way like Angela or in any way as close to the edge as Angela more clearly is. There is, I think, a clear but not over-the-top presentation from the get-go, from this initial encounter with Angela, that this is someone who is traumatized. She is really reactive when James approaches her. There is this way that she can subtly shift states from seeming kind of out of it or dissociative or even childlike to then being very upset or angry. And there are points throughout James and Angela's interactions with each other where she can switch very quickly from seeming helpless to being, kind of frightening. And all of those are indications, right, of somebody who is in some state of disorganization in their own mind, oftentimes because they've experienced things that don't make sense, right, and have overwhelmed them. And someone with like Angela, based on her behavior and then also what we come to learn about her, this is someone who probably didn't just experience a single traumatic event, but was raised in a chronically frightening environment. And so she brings with her this fractured mental state, can easily be misinterpreted or even taken advantage of by others. Again, one of the interesting things about the relationship between James and Angela is this question of like, how much does James, or by extension the player, really care about this person, right? Like, how much are you sympathizing with her? When James says, hey, maybe we should travel together, like, does he mean it? Do you as the player actually want a sidekick? Like, versus the extent to which the player is frightened of her or feels like she's too difficult and doesn't want to have to deal with this. The game never answers those questions or provides neat endings, right? It forces us to sit with the complexity and intensity of people who are in severe states of distress. And I do think that the acting in the remake, for the weirdness that maybe it loses, it brings a layer of depth that did not exist in the original.
I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Okay, so this is one moment I do have to highlight. In the original, James says, I'm kind of lost. And Angela says lost in the craziest line read that is imaginable. She goes like, lost?
Lost?
It's so weird. It's the first interaction you have with someone else in the game. It sets this tone. There's valid criticism that it was 2001. They weren't doing motion capture, who they were paying to do these voices, like, it's a different world on a practical level, but it also, just as the way the characters express themselves, it does set this scene of like, this is not our normal reality. This is a heightened version of reality in which not only is one character overacting in this extreme way, but then the other characters does not seem to be fazed by it at all. Not even to say that it's better or worse, but I do think it probably orients the player into a different psychological position. If you're playing this for the first time and seeing these two talented actors very naturalistically have a conversation together, it's just a different experience that makes it feel less unreal from the start.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe. It's kind of hard to explain, but
I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I don't really care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going either way.
So I think this is a really purposeful, interesting way to start a horror game, where, any horror game needs to basically explain why the character doesn't just immediately leave, right? And oftentimes that's done mechanically because they get trapped somewhere, right? They're on a, spaceship that's been cut off from, communications, whatever it might be. But here, from the get-go, it's this idea of, I'm going into town, regardless of what I encounter, I'm doing it anyway. It's not a mechanical, functional, external reason that's going to keep me here. I'm going to stay here because that is where I'm at this point in my life, right? This is somehow, for James, preferable to the alternative of not being in Silent Hill. The scene with Angela, also just establishes there's this blurriness of reality, right? She says she's looking for someone, and meanwhile she's amongst these graves. So it's like, okay, is she looking for gravesite, right? Is she aware that the people she's looking for are no longer here or not? Or does she lose track of that at some point, right? James is explicitly looking for someone he knows is dead but hopes is alive. The term psychological horror can be thrown around a lot, but there's really something special about how Silent Hill 2 asks the player from the get-go to really be viewing this in terms of what is going on in the minds of the player character and the other characters they meet.
Angela. Okay. Look, I'm not sure what you're planning, but there's always another way.
An interesting theme in Silent Hill 2 is the idea of there being another way. versus there being only one way, which is particularly interesting for a video game where the player is playing and has choice and there are multiple endings. When you meet Angela, she says there's only one way into town. You meet her again now, and James is suggesting, well, there's maybe another way. And she says, I'm not so sure about that. For a game that originally came out kind of at the dawn of the open world video game that was trying to really put forward this idea that video games were a place where you could feel like you could do anything. Like, here's a game that is explicitly asking whether anything you're doing matters, whether the choices you make actually can affect the outcome.
Her name's Mary. She's my wife.
That's a very nice touch that was not possible in the original game, is to be very clear that Angela does not make eye contact with the photograph. It seems like both a comment on her dissociation from this scene, but also this broader question of, like, are they even in the same reality? Like, what does that photograph even look like to her? Like, what is he holding? Can she even see what he sees? I can't remember exactly what happens before this scene, but like, you're fighting some monster, and then you walk into the room and this woman's just draped on the floor, and there's no comment of like, what the hell are you doing? Get up. Like, there's things out there, like none of that. It's just, it all makes sense, and yet it doesn't make sense. And they're immediately trying to understand each other and failing, right? They are not on the same page at all. In the reality of that room that they're in together, it's like all of a sudden the monsters don't exist, right? The only danger is within themselves. Angela is a character that can be easily dismissed as, again, kind of childlike or naive, but in some ways she seems the most clued in from the beginning about the nature of what's going on. And she's most in touch with the hopelessness that is so pervasive throughout the game, but that for James is often then projected out in the monsters he's fighting, in this sort of inane, crazy puzzles and architecture he's navigating. Angela is more self-aware in that sense, that this might all be for nothing.
I'm happy to see you.
Happy to see me?
Alive, I mean.
Oh. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a new scene from this version, interchanged, that suggests, right, that Angela really has never really experienced feeling wanted or loved by anyone except maybe her mother. And even then, there's maybe questions about what that relationship was really like. It gives another touch point in that relationship before we sort of see her again in a more intense way next.
If we stick together, we might just make it out of here.
Out of where?
This town. Silent Hill.
No, it's fine.
I like him saying getting out of here, and she seems very confused about what he even means. Maybe on some level she's the most aware of there is no like here, right? That they're trapped in something that they carry with them wherever they go. This is just a much more human portrayal of Angela, which from a point of view, which is a point of view I care a lot about, of sort of how mental distress, mental disorder is portrayed in media, I think is a real step forward. It's less caricaturish, it's less over the top. But then there's also the loss of that more bizarre presentation where everyone is kind of over the top or wooden, and you sort of have to almost treat them more as archetypes or exaggerations of real life. So I don't think that they've changed sort of Angela's basic perspective or psychology. Right? I think she is this traumatized woman who is shifting between different states in which she is at times completely helpless and terrified, at other times despairing and hopeless, and at other times has more insight into what's going on than anyone else in the game. They've just presented it in a more naturalistic way than I think the original achieved or maybe even tried for.
Please. I'll be good, I promise. Tell him I'll be good, please.
Should we talk about abstract daddy? Yeah.
Daddy!
There is a progression that James is going on in addition to, or in parallel with his quest to find Mary, in which the possibility that he can actually connect with other real people is being explored, right? And there's an open question of whether he'll actually make contact with another person or just be another one of these lost souls kind of drifting through each other until they meet some inevitable tragic conclusion. Here, for the first time, they are experiencing some version of shared reality, but it doesn't make sense yet. She is calling something daddy that does not look remotely human, right? He fights this thing that, from the player's point of view, is very uncomplicated. It's just a weird blob. And so even though he is saving Angela, in some sense of that word, from this monster, it doesn't mean anything similar to him as it does to her, right? The significance of what he's doing and who he's fighting is so far away from whatever Angela must be seeing, right? And whatever her association to this creature or character is. James is actually maybe getting a little bit of real, through staticky noise, right? Information about Angela that's not filtered through his own stuff. And even having to, physically move through space in a way that is maybe an empathic connection to what Angela had to do rather than just his own thing, which then I think directly informs the conversation they have at the end of the boss fight.
I see what you're doing. It's always the same with you. You're only after one thing.
Angela, please.
You don't have to lie. Go ahead. Say it. Or you could just force me. Like he always did.
I really like this update of their interaction after the daddy fight. Angela has been so chronically exposed to malevolence that it's hard for her to see the world through any other lens, right? The expectation is that even if James is doing something ostensibly beneficial for her, there's some evil intent. And it's made more explicit, the kind of sexual abuse that she likely faced in this scene than it ever is, I think, explicitly in the original game.
Admit it. You didn't want her around anymore.
No.
You probably found someone else.
No.
They pair her distorted view of reality, right, in which there's this assumption that James is pursuing her as a sexual object, with her having, again, this incredible insight. Right? Even as she's seeing her own worlds in such a confused way, she sees right through James. She is absolutely correct in the first one to say, before James gets there by probably many hours of play, that he didn't want Mary around anymore, and that his guilt is what is driving so much of this experience. And he becomes angry for the first time, manifestly, with her for poking that idea that he's trying to keep at bay. I think it honors Angela's arc in a certain way, right? That she's so trapped within herself and her oppressive world, but she also has this capacity to understand that is remarkable, but is not appreciated and is not being reciprocated. And so again, she runs off, right? And they're sort of left alone again. Scene still gives me chills every time. It's, I think, one of the most poignant cutscenes in a video game, one of the most poignant sort of culminations of a relationship spread out over the course of a game or any work of art. On a fan theory level, right, it's this confirmation that what we by that point felt we knew to be true, which is that everyone in Silent Hill is experiencing it differently. But on this interpersonal, emotional level, right, it's the one and only time when James really steps into someone else's reality, right? And the player steps into somebody else's reality. He feels the heat of it. He gets a sense of what it's like to be in Angela's mind and feel her type of distress and her type of pain and history.
It's hot as hell in here.
You see it too? For me, it's always like this.
But at the same time, right, it is sad, even sort of tragic scene because they're not able to meet each other enough and find a way out together. They continue to go their separate ways. And James continues to hold on to this idea that he is different and he can find a different way out. They changed a line from the original where when she asks for the knife back and he says no, and she says, saving it for yourself. I think he says, in again, this very kind of dreamlike monotone, like, I would never kill myself.
Me? No, I'd never kill myself.
And it's very eerie. And I think maybe particularly for me as a teenager at the time, thinking a lot about the impact of suicide, that made a particular impression on me. But this version too, I think, captures this sense of connection, but ultimately sort of being necessary but not sufficient for these two people to be there for each other.
Have it your way. It doesn't change anything.
Flames definitely seem to me like this sense of this constant heat and pressure. What Angela says in an early scene of like, maybe it's better just to run, like needing to be at a constant sprint, just trying to get away from these flames that are always licking at your heels and can never quite be escaped. And that is her experience. Yeah. Whereas James's is one of everything being obscured. Even when you're indoors, everything is foggy and hard to see. And so it is perhaps a way that he deflects guilt and responsibility, right? The things he swings at and shoots at, it's only after the fact that he really sees what they are. Only when he's kicking their heads in do you actually get a good look with your flashlight, because otherwise it's all too obscured. And that, yeah, perhaps is not an inherent feature of Silent Hill, but that is part of James's Silent Hill.
Hey, who's there?
It wasn't me. I didn't do it. I didn't do it, I swear.
Hey, are you okay?
I didn't do anything. He was like that when I got here.
So yeah, Eddie's on a different journey. He is a less fleshed out character who presents as a slovenly man-child, but then is harboring this bottomless rage that we come to discover. So this version of Eddie, like Angela, is much more nuanced and humanized. The original Eddie in that first scene is vomiting constantly, and it elicits this strong sense of disgust. You can't wait for this cutscene to be over. It's gross. I understand why, as things are becoming more naturalistic in this version, they chose to make Eddie less kind of viscerally gross and maybe a little more relatable, someone that you're a little more inclined to empathize with, which then has its own kind of reward, so to speak, when you come to understand more of what Eddie is capable of.
I see that you didn't make it out yet.
Yeah. I just didn't get around to it yet.
At least you got your appetite back.
Yeah, so one other thing I'll say about Eddie, right, is that in this version, I think James comes off more as an asshole. This snide comment about getting your appetite back. There is this interesting idea. Angela is just constantly running from these oppressive flames and doesn't know what else to do but look for this maybe one source of joy that she vaguely remembers from years ago. And James is tortured by this guilt that he cannot, no matter how much he tries, like fully obscure. It's like, what is Eddie doing here? Like, it seems like he just doesn't have anywhere better to be, which is, when you think about it, like maybe the most tragic character of all, right? That he just didn't get around to leaving Silent Hill yet. Like, it makes no difference here, there, like it's all the same to him. It's a different kind of prison that he is in. He is in a more maybe truly hopeless place. There's not even anyone clear that he's looking for. Perhaps that's why, as we're about to see, Eddie was never going to make it.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the fact that he's not eating pizza in this scene, but he's eating a giant tub of ice cream with his hands.
I wasn't even sure what it was. I thought it was like popcorn with butter, but yeah, okay. So yeah, ice cream melting on his hands. You know, my first reaction to that is it's way more pathetic as opposed to kind of gluttonous. He found ice cream, he can't even be bothered or didn't care that he couldn't find a utensil to eat it with. Then it has this quieter moment where James points out his appetite, right? He tries to wipe his hand clean, right? And there's this shame that is brought up, right? That is probably a central emotional experience for Eddie. It's maybe part of a general attempt to make Eddie a little less sort of objectified as a, sort of disgusting person and a little more sort of sad and pathetic. It's my take.
You want to talk down to me some more? Tell me to relax? You're just like the rest of them, James.
No, I don't want.
Shut up! You think I'm stupid. You think I don't see it. But you've been laughing at me all along. Ever since we first met. But you ain't laughing now, are you?
In this portrayal, when Eddie says, you're laughing at me too, does that resonate with the player? Have we been laughing at Eddie? I don't know if we have, versus just feeling kind of sorry for him. Because I think there's something to this idea, similar with Angela, where on the one hand, we're seeing this person who is trapped in their horror and their trauma and their experience, and they can't see the world for anything else than that. And that is what feeds their suffering and leads them to recreate these situations over and over again. There's also this idea that they are reflecting something about James, right? That even though you spend so much of it by yourself solving puzzles, fighting monsters, it's this game of dyads, of relationships. You're coming into contact with one other person at a time. And this idea of projecting something onto you, but you're also projecting something onto them, right? James's dysfunction is this need to be the hero and the savior until he feels unappreciated. And that is what occurred before the events of the game with Mary, where he took care of her until it made him too angry, and he felt like she was no longer like playing the role in the way that he wanted. And then he was sick of it and took control rather than, trying to explore what Mary wanted or letting things follow a more natural course. I think that part of the experience of playing Silent Hill 2 is inhabiting a character that from the beginning seems like pretty stock, just a regular white guy trying to find his wife kind of thing. And I think ideally, if you're really absorbed in the game and really appreciating these complexities and getting into these relationships that form, by the time you find out he killed Mary, it's not like the shocking reveal. It's the natural conclusion of your understanding this person to be just as lost and confused and conflicted and damaged as anyone else that he's encountered. James keeps reliving with all of these characters this kind of savior-like complex. He's the good guy coming in, trying to be reasonable, but ultimately failing to do so, failing to actually connect and help the other person feel understood. There's, again, as with Angela, this idea that James ostensibly is trying to be helpful, but he's not being helpful. And he does think he's better than Eddie, right? He does think his quest is nobler. He does think he's a better person. That is partly why there is no alternate solution to their final exchange than just it being combat and James fighting him like he would any other monster in town. With the ability to really see the detail on James's face, it has the potential for a really nice double meaning. For someone who's new to the game, it reads as he's killed a person for the first, like he touches his hands like he's weighing in. And for someone who knows where this is going, there's this sense of is there beginning, is this just the spark of deeper awareness, right? And of this not being a totally new experience or sensation.
Obviously, there's a scene in which Angela where you explicitly see the world that she's living in. And we never really get that in the original game with Eddie. Every time you see Eddie in the remake, his breath freezes in air. And my interpretation of that was that it alludes that you are seeing Eddie in his world, which is frozen, which is cold.
That's super interesting. Yeah, and I feel like I should have noticed it now that you mentioned it. But yeah, the breath thing is real. Yeah, I mean, your final battle with him is in a meat locker. And yeah, my memory from the original, right, is that the closest you get to understanding Eddie's world is this: there's a bunch of dead bodies around. It's not very fleshed out. It's an interesting thought and is a kind of elemental contrast maybe to Angela's room, a world on fire, right, that Angela lives in. Is he's in this cold, frozen place. He's not even looking for anyone in particular. Or the person that he's looking for was also his tormentor or his bully who he has to kill again. If Angela had to endure so much pain and abuse at home, but also had this idealized mother, whoever she really was, right, that she holds out as someone to seek and run for. Eddie is alone, right? He's just by himself. It's not a world populated by people, just corpses or, frozen hunks of meat. It paints a very isolated picture of what this, guy who was clearly pushed around, and there was no one apparently around, right, to provide Eddie with an alternate view or an alternate way of dealing with the feelings that generated for him. Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm glad they did that, right? That it brings a little more coherence than I think existed probably in the first one in terms of what Eddie brought with him into Silent Hill.
Alex had so much to say about Silent Hill 2 and its endings that we've got another video coming very soon. In the meantime, you can find links to Alex's books, including The Gaming Mind, in the description below. Don't forget to comment below with what other games you'd like to see on the show in the future, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this and beyond.